All right, so let's talk a little bit about Darwin, some of his influences, and the theory of natural selection and evolution. Whenever we talk about evolution, and we talked about this with characteristics of life, we're looking at basically how do species change over time, so the process of change over time. Darwin is going to explain this, and he explained this by basically how do modern organisms evolve over long periods through descent from a common ancestor. And so he's looking at those modifications, adaptations, struggle for existence, survival of the fittest, and how we survive. Just a little bit about him. He traveled around the world collecting specimens, and his information really gives us some perspective about things like drug-resistant bacteria or emerging diseases like right now coronavirus. And so it's looking at things like that and how those microorganisms have changed over time because of adaptations that have helped them to survive. So we look at 3 patterns of biological diversity. We look at how they vary globally, locally, and over time. So species vary globally. Whenever they are in ecologically similar places or similar habitats, they will look similar to one another, even though they're not directly related. We find that species vary locally, so species that are in the same area will be similar to one another, but maybe have different adaptations that are better suited to their specific environment, like the turtle with the long neck, because the vegetation is up higher. That's going to be a little different than the other turtles that are in that same region. Species vary over time, which we see in the fossil record. We can see extinct animals that are similar to living species. With Darwin, his ideas were shaped by some other scientists of the time, and I don't think it's important that you memorize these. I just wanted to introduce it as just hey, other people were thinking about this, and so these were kind of people that were thinking at the same time as Darwin. So we have a scientist named Hutton, and he was looking at deep time and basically talking about how the Earth is older than they initially thought, so that the planet's history stretches back over a long period of time. With Lyell, he was looking at how geological processes are the same today as they were millions of years ago, and just looking at kind of how those work together. Whenever we talk about Lamarck, he was introducing this idea of acquired characteristics, which are going to be something that's acquired over the course of your life. So whether it's you lose a finger to an accident, or you acquire some mutations in your DNA because of prolonged sun exposure, those types of things, Lamarck said, were going to be passed on. He was assuming basically that animals have a drive to become perfect, and so like a bird can make its wings bigger and a giraffe can stretch its neck, and then those traits can be passed on. But really, any of those acquired traits, there's no genetic component, so that's why his theory is actually not correct. Whenever we look at Lamarck and kind of why he was wrong, it's basically that, is that there's no genetic component. The acquired traits can't be passed on. There's no inborn drive for perfection for animals. I mean, they are going to have the traits that they're born with, and either those traits are going to be suited for the environment and help them survive, or they're not. For Lamarck, I mean, he did suggest that species weren't fixed, which he was the first to do that, so that helped Darwin in his thinking as well. And he also recognized links between environment and kind of the structures that organisms have. So like giraffes have a long neck, so they can reach the vegetation on the trees. But the giraffes didn't get the long neck over their lifetime. It just happened over many, many generations. The other scientist that influenced Darwin was Malthus, and he reasoned that if a population grew unchecked, then there wouldn't be enough space or food. And so Darwin's take on this was what he called struggle for existence, which is organisms are going to create a lot of offspring, but not all of them can survive. So only the ones that have the best traits so that they can get the resources to survive will be able to survive and then pass on their genetic information. With natural selection, we are looking at a process where the best adaptations survive and then they leave more offspring, so they produce more offspring. This natural selection is going to lead to changes in populations over time because those adaptations that make the organisms most fit are going to be passed on. With natural selection, we also think of it in terms of microevolution because it's changing allele frequencies, meaning it's changing how frequently different variations of a gene occur. And so that change is actually evolution on a micro scale. So even if it's not, a huge change that a fish became a bird, then it's still a small change in the population, and it's a change in how frequently that genetic information occurs. The important thing to remember is that evolution occurs in populations and not single organisms. Single organisms don't change. They don't evolve. They're going to, grow and develop, but they're not going to evolve in their lifetime. Evolution happens over many, many generations within a population. For natural selection, there's a few parameters that we look at. So we look at struggle for existence, variations and adaptations, and then survival of the fittest. So struggle for existence, again, that came from Malthus. We're looking at competition for food, for space, basically for resources to survive. So organisms that have good variations and adaptations are going to be able to survive better than organisms that don't have those same traits. So variations, these are going to be natural differences in heritable traits. So everybody in the class looks different. There's different varieties of plants that are all able to survive. It's just going to be a natural difference inside of those traits. An adaptation is going to be a positive trait, so an inherited characteristic that increases the ability to survive and reproduce. So an adaptation is something that allows an organism to survive better. Types of adaptations that we look at, so things that help organisms survive better. We talk about mimicry, which is harmless organisms mimicking something that's harmful to help them survive because predators won't eat them. We look at camouflage, so how organisms can blend in with the environment to help them survive better. We look at things like defensive mechanisms, so how a bird makes itself appear bigger so that predators aren't going to eat it. But those are things that are inherited traits that are going to be able to then be passed on to other organisms. So an owl that's better at making itself look big is going to be less likely to get eaten, and that being an inherited trait is something that could be passed on then. So natural selection, we talk about survival of the fittest. With fitness, this is talking about the ability of an organism to survive and reproduce, and survival of the fittest is the survival of that organism that's best able to reproduce and survive. So if an organism has high fitness, that means that it has high survival, but also high reproduction, and then if it has low fitness, low survival and reproduction. This doesn't mean strongest, it doesn't mean biggest, it doesn't mean tallest. It means that it's going to have the best trait to survive in the environment. So whenever we look at surviving in terms of evolution, we're really talking about the ability to pass on traits. If an organism survives and lives for 90 years but doesn't have any offspring, all of that genetic information dies with that organism, and so really in terms of evolution, it's not surviving. With survival of the fittest, we're looking at how natural selection, we look at how the environment doesn't select organisms. It's just that the organisms are going to survive that have the best traits. And so environment, it's not selecting and saying, oh, this one survives, this one survives. It survives based on the traits that it has. These are just some summaries of natural selection, and so this is looking at variations within populations. So like we talked about, everyone looking different. These are going to be inherited characteristics, so this is something that we can pass on to our offspring. Organisms are going to struggle to survive because more offspring are produced than what's needed, and so those with the best traits will survive. That's survival of the fittest as well. And then populations change over time based on those adaptations that allow them to survive better. This is different than artificial selection because artificial selection is basically nature provides the variations, but humans select what's most useful. So we breed tomato plants so that it has the nicest tomatoes. We breed apples so that they taste the best. We breed dogs so that they look the nicest. We breed horses so that they run the fastest. So we select a trait that is, maybe it doesn't help them survive in terms of evolution, but just that we like. It's also different than random selection, which is going to be selection based on things like natural disasters. So random selection means that it doesn't depend on the traits at all. It's just chance, like the forest burns down. Well, that tree wasn't going to survive because it was in a forest fire. It wasn't because that tree didn't have good traits. And so random selection is different than natural selection and artificial selection as well. Whenever we look at natural selection, organisms that are selected based on natural selection are selected based on their phenotype, meaning their physical characteristics, not based on their genotype or the genetic makeup that they have. And so that phenotype is really important because that is how the environment acts on the organism. Finally, principle of common descent is the idea that all species living and extinct are descended from common ancestors, and we'll look at this with evidence for evolution in terms of how it helps to support the ideas that Darwin put forth and how natural selection works, and basically living species descending from common ancestors that have modifications that allow them to survive. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. Otherwise, we will talk about your questions in class.